The threat was only 90 miles away. A decorated F-18 pilot warned that hundreds of drones were reportedly sitting in Cuba, close enough to put Key West, Homestead Air Reserve Base, MacDill, and CENTCOM under a terrifying strategic shadow. At the same time, Washington was welcoming Iraq's new prime minister, Ali al-Zahid, while the war with Iran sat under a ceasefire that barely felt alive. Iranian proxies had already struck U.S. military positions across the Gulf region. The Strait of Hormuz was being watched for possible kinetic escalation. And then the danger moved closer. Because if Iranian drones, trainers, and hostile partners were really building pressure from Cuba, the battlefield had quietly shifted from the Middle East to America's doorstep. Inside the West Wing, cameras caught a brief but important moment. President Trump greeted Iraq's prime minister with warm words, calling attention to his recent election and signaling that this meeting mattered. But behind the handshake was a larger struggle. Iraq sits between Washington's military needs and Tehran's regional influence. U.S. bases inside Iraq remain critical if American forces must protect troops, move aircraft, or respond to attacks from Iran-backed groups. This was not just diplomacy. It was control of airspace, access, leverage, and survival. The meeting came during a fragile pause in fighting with Iran. Officially, there was a ceasefire. Strategically, nobody seemed relaxed. Reports suggested the region was only hours away from possible escalation near the Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most sensitive energy corridors. That narrow waterway can shake global markets. Oil moves through it. Navies watch it. Governments fear it. And if it closes, even briefly, the shock does not stay in the Gulf. It reaches shipping lanes, fuel prices, supply chains, and boardrooms thousands of miles away. That is the pressure point. Senator James Lankford, a member of the Senate Finance and Homeland Security Committees, framed the Iraq meeting as urgent. He had visited Baghdad the previous year, met Iraq's earlier prime minister, and also traveled to Erbil in the Kurdish north. His message was simple. Iraq is not a side issue. It is a pressure point. The United States has spent lives, money, and years trying to shape stability there. If Washington wants to contain Tehran, it needs Iraq's leadership to remain independent, not absorbed into Iran's orbit. That separation is the whole game. For decades, Iran has built influence across Iraq through politics, militias, and security networks. During the Iraq War, Iranian forces crossed into Iraq and helped Shia militants learn how to attack U.S. troops using improvised explosive devices. Lankford said hundreds of Americans died because Iranian operatives supported attacks inside Iraq. That history still drives every strategic calculation around Baghdad. Then came one chilling symbol. When Lankford was in Baghdad, he saw a large image of Qasem Soleimani near the presidential palace. Soleimani was the Iranian general killed by a U.S. strike in Iraq, and he had long been linked to operations against Americans. That image was not decoration, it was a message. It said Iran's presence was not theoretical. It was visible. It was political. It was standing near the center of Iraqi power. The concern is that Iraq could become a corridor for Iranian pressure instead of a sovereign partner. If Baghdad tilts too far toward Tehran, U.S. bases become more vulnerable, regional planning becomes harder, and Iran gains depth. The handshake in Washington was really a test of alignment, not friendship, not ceremony. And alignment can decide whether a country becomes a partner or a problem. But Iraq also offers more than military access. It offers business, investment, and regional connection. In the Kurdish north, especially around Erbil, American investment has been active. Baghdad has also shown interest in opening space for more business engagement. Yet that opportunity depends on whether Iraq can manage internal violence, militia pressure, and competing loyalties. Markets hate uncertainty. Militias create it. If Iraq stabilizes, it becomes a bridge into a region filled with strategic partners. The United States has deep relationships with Israel and Jordan. Turkey remains a NATO ally, Other Gulf partners also matter in the wider balance against Tehran. That is why one meeting at the White House carried so much weight. It was not only about one government. It was about whether Iraq becomes a platform for trade and security, or a pressure valve for Iran. One path builds leverage. The other exports chaos. Then the conversation widened. Matthew "Wiz" Buckley, a decorated F-18 pilot and Top Gun graduate, warned that the danger was not only overseas. He pointed to reports of hundreds of drones in Cuba, roughly 90 miles from Key West. He named the nearby assets: Naval Air Station Key West, Homestead Air Reserve Base, MacDill Air Force Base, CENTCOM. That is the southern flank. Buckley's warning was stark. While attention focuses on Iran and the Gulf, adversaries could use Cuba to create pressure close to U.S. territory. He also warned that China and Russia would benefit from enabling hostile actors there. Former Miami Mayor Francis Suarez added another layer, saying Iranian trainers were reportedly on the ground in Cuba to show local forces how to operate those drones. If true, this is not distance, this is doorstep strategy. The same conflict that feels remote on a map suddenly has coordinates Americans recognize. Key West, Homestead, MacDill, CENTCOM. The names sound domestic. The implications do not. That is what made the Cuba warning so powerful. It collapsed the illusion of distance. For years, Americans have watched wars through screens, maps, and briefing rooms. The Middle East looked far away. Hormuz looked far away. Iran's proxies looked far away. But a drone network in Cuba would change the psychological geography of the threat. It would mean the same pressure tactics used across the Gulf could be adapted near American territory. Not with aircraft carriers, not with invasion forces, with drones, trainers, partners, and plausible deniability. Cheap tools can create expensive fear. That is the modern battlefield. It is not always a tank crossing a border. Sometimes it is a militia hitting a base. Sometimes it is a ship threatened near an energy corridor. Sometimes it is a drone staged near an island close enough to make planners nervous. And sometimes it is all three at once. On Capitol Hill, the question became whether lawmakers would support broader action against Iran. Langford said there was willingness among him and others to allow the president to do what he believed was necessary. But war carries a cost. Every escalation involves families, service members, and consequences that cannot be reversed. That is the moral weight behind every strategic sentence. Still, Langford argued that Iran has attacked the United States and its interests for 47 years. He pointed to Iran's proxy network, threats to the Strait of Hormuz, and the danger of Tehran acquiring a nuclear weapon. His position was blunt. Iran must not be allowed to build one. The warning was not just about a future weapon. It was about a regime already using proxies, pressure, and geography to stretch American power. If Iran can threaten bases in Iraq, pressure shipping near Hormuz, and reportedly help drone activity in Cuba, then the problem is no longer one front. It is a network, and networks are harder to bomb than armies. Energy sits at the center. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a military location. It is a global economic choke point. If shipping is threatened there, oil markets react, prices move, and businesses far from the Gulf feel the shock. That is why sanctions and blockades become tools of power. They are not bombs, but they can cut off money, slow weapons production, and squeeze regimes that depend on exports. In modern conflict, finance is a battlefield. The discussion then shifted to Russia. The broadcast described Senator Lindsey Graham's reported passing and his work on a bill targeting Russian oil and natural gas sales. The logic was similar. Countries buying Russian energy were helping fund Moscow's war against Ukraine. By sanctioning those buyers, lawmakers hoped to choke off revenue flowing into Russia's military machine. Money becomes ammunition. Langford said Katie Britt had taken up Graham's bill, with co-sponsors being added to push it forward as bipartisan pressure. The goal was to force Russia toward ending the war by attacking the cash pipeline behind it. No cash pipeline, no war machine. That was the theory. The pattern was clear. Against Iran, squeeze oil and proxies. Against Russia, squeeze energy buyers. Against drone threats near Cuba, isolate the networks behind them. Modern conflict looks like market denial. It looks like cutting access. It looks like choking logistics. It looks like forcing an adversary to spend more, move slower, and trust fewer partners. That is why the Iraq meeting, the Cuba warning, and the energy sanctions all belong to the same story. They were not separate headlines. They were different faces of the same contest. Who controls the routes? Who controls the money? Who controls the pressure points? And who can make the other side feel unsafe without firing the first shot? This entire story is bigger than one meeting, one drone report, or one ceasefire. It shows how global power works when nations compete, like ruthless corporations. Bases become distribution hubs. Airspace becomes market access. Sanctions become financial warfare. Alliances become strategic partnerships. And a small island 90 miles from Key West can become a pressure point in a worldwide contest. The same logic appeared in the domestic debate over the Save America Act. Langford said 36 states already have voter ID, while 14 do not. He said supporters lacked 60 Senate votes, but wanted changes in place before 2028. Every front was about control. Control of borders, control of money, control of energy, control of legitimacy. That was the pattern. The argument was not only over war, it was over access. Who gets access to territory? Who gets access to markets? Who gets access to elections? Who gets access to the levers that define power before the first missile is launched? And that is the deeper warning. The map still shows countries as clean shapes with borders, capitals, and coastlines. But power does not move that cleanly anymore. It moves through militias. It moves through oil contracts. It moves through shipping lanes. It moves through drones small enough to hide, but dangerous enough to change strategy. It moves through alliances, proxy groups, sanctions, and bases most people never think about until a crisis begins. By then, the battlefield has already been built. That is why the drone warning near Cuba mattered. Not because it guaranteed war, because it revealed the new shape of pressure. Iran does not need to match American power directly if it can stretch American attention. Russia does not need to win every battle if it can keep money flowing. China does not need to appear on the front line if others can create stress where America is vulnerable. And Iraq does not need to collapse to become dangerous. It only has to drift far enough toward Tehran that Washington loses room to maneuver. That is how leverage works. Slowly, quietly, then suddenly. The White House handshake was about that leverage. The debate over Iran was about that leverage. The sanctions on Russian energy were about that leverage. The Save America Act debate, in a different way, was about that leverage too. Every piece pointed back to the same uncomfortable truth. Power is no longer measured only by who has the biggest army. It is measured by who can control the choke points before the public notices they exist. If hostile drones can appear near Cuba while war pressure builds near Hormuz, the real warning is simple. The map says the battlefield is over there. The drones say it is already here.